Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our event titled A Hidden Collection Emerges, German and Japanese World War II Captured Maps from the UC Berkeley and Stanford University Libraries. Our panelists include Susan Powell, our GIS and map librarian, Heiko Mühr, our map metadata and curatorial specialist, both from the Earth Sciences and Map Library, and our special guest, Julie Sweetkind-Singer, the Associate University Librarian for Science and Engineering Resources at Stanford University. I'm Bonita Dias, the Library Supervisor here at our Earth Sciences and Map Library, and I'm moderating today's events with my co-host, Kristen Greenland, our Chemical and Physical Sciences Librarian. Kristen and I organized this event as part of our outreach program in the Engineering and Physical Sciences Division of the UC Berkeley Library. If you have any questions during our event, please type them into the chat, and at the end of the event, we'll ask our panelists the questions you've submitted. Now we'll have Susan start our presentation, and I will share my screen.
Okay, thanks Bonita for that introduction, and to you and Kristen for organizing the event today. As Bonita said, I'm Susan Powell. I'm the GIS and Map Librarian at UC Berkeley Libraries. And I'm going to start us off by giving a broad overview of World War II captured maps, including both the German and the Japanese collections. Next slide, please. So to set the stage a little bit, during World War II, just as today, the maps and geospatial information was incredibly crucial to operations and to military planning and strategy. And militaries required maps for all sorts of purposes, from large-scale planning all the way down to tactical maneuvers. And because of this, they required a great variety of scales of maps and a great variety of content types in their maps. And so you can see on the screen 2 examples. The one kind of in the background is from the German maps, and the one in the foreground is from the Japanese map collections. And all of the images in my slides come from the Stanford and UC Berkeley collections, digitized collections. So the Japanese military had been producing maps of foreign lands called Gaihozu maps for decades leading up to World War II. And they continued this process throughout the war. The German military, on the other hand, because of restrictions placed on them following the end of World War I, really didn't ramp up mapping until 1936. And that was like the military mapping because of those restrictions. But following 1936, after Hitler's rise to power, they really started ramping up not just their production of maps, they started acquiring map sets from different places, and also, can you go back a slide, Benita, please? They also started ramping up their kind of military mapping, intelligence and operations. The Americans, on the other hand, were largely unprepared going into World War II and needed to ramp up production quickly and skills quickly. So the US Army Map Service was established in 1941 and really kind of took on the topographic mapping of the areas of interest. There was also the Office of Strategic Services in the US, which was focused more on intelligence mapping. And so throughout the war, these militaries were racing to ramp up and produce tons, literally tons of mapping materials which were used during the war. And I'll go to the next slide, please. So towards the end of World War II, there were these giant tons of material out there, and these were prized possessions. And so all of the militaries were interested in acquiring these as the war kind of ended. In Europe, the situation was that Hitler had ordered a decree in early 1945 that all infrastructure be destroyed before falling into enemy hands, but the commander responsible for carrying out that order stalled and then ultimately didn't carry out that order. And so instead of being destroyed, maps from the military were hidden in various locations in salt mines and warehouses, and secret Allied forces were able to track down those materials in occupied areas and return them to, were able to capture them. In Japan, there was also an order to destroy maps and air photos before they were captured. And in large part that was carried out, although there were some maps and plates for producing maps that survived that, and those were captured, ultimately captured by the Allied forces. Next slide, please. So following the end of World War II, many of these captured maps were shipped to the US and processed by the Army Map Service. And this coincided with also the Army Map Service beginning a program to distribute maps to academic and public libraries around the country, in part to prepare and ensure readiness for foreign engagement in the future. So most of these maps distributed through the Army Map Service depository program were AMS map series themselves, but it also included these captured maps, a smaller subset of them. And we have memos from the 1940s when this program was getting started that document that there were 35 libraries that received maps through the captured maps distribution program. And UC Berkeley and Stanford were two of those libraries. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been doing recently is charting to shine a light on these hidden collections in our libraries. For many reasons, the captured maps in libraries across the US were not as well known as the maps produced by the Army Map Service itself. And I think we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But in the past 5 to 10 years, both the Stanford libraries and UC Berkeley libraries have begun projects to try and identify these maps in our collection. Oftentimes they weren't identified even as being part of the captured maps distribution program, and to update the cataloging for those records, and also to digitize the map sheets in order to make those collections more accessible for use by people around the world. And next slide, please. So I'll wrap up with talking just a little bit about what's happening at Berkeley. We've been, over the past, again, 5 years, starting to work on our German captured maps. We've been incorporating maps that we have been taking in from the UC Riverside map collections. And as of the beginning of the pandemic, we had processed approximately 10,000 of the German maps, which we estimate is about half of our total holdings of German maps. So in summer last year, we launched our digital collections site, which gives some context for the maps and also links out to about those 10,000 maps, which are in our library's digital library site. And when we return to campus, we're planning to complete the work on these German maps and also start to assess our Japanese map collections. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, here's our links for our library guide to the German World War II maps, and published just yesterday, our article that Heiko and I authored on the some aspects of the German maps was published in the Journal of Map and Geography Libraries, and that link is in the chat for you. And I would like to end by just acknowledging that this was a truly team effort to on this project in all aspects. And so everything from staff involved to various people who offered advice and support. So I want to extend acknowledgements to all of those folks. All right, and with that, I turn it over to Julie, I think.
Thanks, Susan. We have Heiko slides up. Do we want to? Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you. Next slide, please. 1 minute, getting my notes pulled up. The maps, collectively known as Gaihozu, began to be produced in Japan during the Meiji period, which lasted from about 1868 through 1912. The Land Survey Department of the General Staff Headquarters was mandated to map certain territories beyond their borders, the outer lands or the foreign lands or the Gaihozu. This work continued throughout the first half of the 20th century, ending with the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945. Next slide, please. The regions mapped included Korea, China, Manchuria, Alaska, Siberia, Micronesia, Taiwan, Mongolia, Thailand, and more. Original mapping was carried out as well as a capture of maps from other nations. Stanford now holds 11,000 sheets from this set at a wide variety of scales covering a range of types and topics. Next slide. The majority of maps are topographic at scales from 1 to 20,000 to 1 to 200,000. Next. Aeronautical charts typically range in scale from 1 to 1 million to 1 to 2 million. Next slide. Numerous city plans are held, including highly detailed plans such as this 3-sheet map set of Shanghai from 1941 at a scale of 1 to 5,347. And this map also shows the distribution of the different groups of people that were living in Shanghai during that time. Next slide. You'll note here that other city plans include much less detail and more surrounding topography. This is a map of Seoul, South Korea at 1 to 10,000 scale. Next. Some of the maps are of road networks, such as this set of maps from Manchuria. Next, please. Other maps include a wealth of annotations, such as this set from Russia. And you'll see on the next slide, please, there's a detail that shows the legend and the kind of information that's captured. And then finally, in the next slide, you'll see a map of Manchuria that was originally printed in Russian with overlaid annotations in Japanese. Next, please. Here you'll see detailed information that's included about the road networks, the ports, food supplies, and elevation. Next, please. So how did the maps get to the United States? As Susan mentioned, the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, and the mapping agencies were given the directive from above to burn the maps before the arrival of the Allied forces. While this certainly did happen, not everything ended up being destroyed. Maps and plates were discovered at the Geographical Survey Institute in the Nagano Prefecture by Colonel Dunbar of the United States Army. The plates were sent to Inagi Chiba Prefecture, where 50 copies of each map were printed. These were sent to the Army Map Service in the United States. Maps were also removed from the Southern Manchuria Railroad Company, the Narashino Army School, and the General Staff Office of the Japan Imperial Army. As Susan mentioned earlier, many US libraries contributed to the war effort by providing materials to the government and the military, including books, maps, photographs, and reports. The AMS never forgot this generosity and decided to thank the libraries by distributing the output of their work, as well as the captured maps to those libraries willing to take them. The libraries had to agree to terms of deposit, which required they be cataloged and loaned upon request. In a letter dated November 15th, 1945, W.D. Milne, the colonel of the AMS Corps of Engineers, wrote to the members of the AMS Depository Library Program to say that, quote, American units captured a rather large quantity of foreign maps, unquote. He noted there were a large number of duplicates and stated that it would be, quote, desirable and beneficial to distribute to civilian institutions, unquote. He asked that libraries let him know if there was interest. In the end, 35 geographically dispersed libraries across the United States agreed to the conditions and took the maps starting in the early 1950s. Next slide. So maps came into Stanford libraries by 2 routes. The Hoover Library on the Stanford campus was one of the original 35 libraries. Almost immediately, the head of the Hoover Library negotiated the transfer of the captured German maps to the main library on campus, Green Library, where the maps would be cataloged and absorbed into the central map collection. This transfer happened in 1952. The Japanese maps were held in the East Asia Library, part of the Hoover Libraries, for another 50 years. These maps were transferred to the Branner Earth Sciences Library and Map Collections in 2002, and processing began on this set nearly a decade later, in about 2010, 60 years after having been accepted by Stanford. The collection was cataloged, indexed, and scanned over the next decade. The cataloging, indexing, and processing were primarily carried out by Jane Ingalls and Shizuka Nakazaki, with the scanning managed by Deirdre Fizel in conjunction with numerous staff, including Peter Crandall and Megan Trott, as well as the digital production group staff. In 2019 and 2020, Greg March, the map librarian at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I discussed transferring their collection of captured maps to Stanford. Their collection had been moved from one place to another and from one department to another over the years, finally ending up in the UTK libraries in 1989. Greg knew they would not have the resources to process the collection and wanted to make sure they would be cataloged, scanned, and made available to the general public. The maps were shipped to Stanford in 2020 and have now been completely processed. Tamar Rabid managed the German map processing and Shizuka Nakazaki the Japanese maps. Andrea Olson oversaw the work of both processing streams. From UTK, we received 9,466 German maps and 5,995 Japanese sheets. While the overlap of the collection was substantial, about 80%, there were many new sets for us, 29 from the German collection and 23 from the Japanese collection. 43 existing sets had new maps or different editions added from the German collection, and 72 existing map sets were supplemented by the incoming Japanese maps. The duplicate maps are being shipped to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency Library. Next slide. In terms of processing, all the Japanese maps were cataloged both in English and in Japanese. When the maps are scanned, their digital surrogates appear in the catalog record with an interactive viewer with a link to the index map for the set. It should be noted that while the German maps have been cataloged and indexed, they have yet to be scanned. Next slide. For each set of more than 9 maps, we created an interactive index, allowing one to find the area of interest through a map with a link that takes one directly to the interactive viewer that allows for immediate downloading of the full resolution image. The processing of the Japanese map collection was a huge effort spanning over a decade and complete due to staff dedicated to the project. It has definitely been worth it, as these maps are some of the most heavily used digital items in our collections, accessed by scholars, students, and the general public around the world. Next slide, please. Finally, as this has been a very quick overview of the project, I've provided links here to the online index, to the topic guide to learn more, and to a recent article on the project written by Greg March and myself. Many thanks to Greg and his staff for their work on moving the maps, and to the members of the Stanford team for their work on these collections. And I'll pass it over now to Heiko.
Thanks, Julie. I'm the map cataloger at UC Berkeley. I'm also a lab social historian. That shapes the story that I'm going to tell you. Social historians are interested in institutions. How do they function? Are they effective? How do they adapt to change? Mapping agencies, big map-making machines, are at the heart of this story. They produce large sets of maps, which together cover vast regions. These large data sets are also known as map series. Some have long, complicated publication histories. Next slide. The first military mapping agency emerged in France, a relatively unified state capable of raising funds. In 1688, King Louis XIV established the military archives that had a cartography department, the Dépôt de la Guerre. One innovator was an Italian immigrant, Giovanni Domenico Cassini. Cassini had a passion for quality map data. In order to obtain it, Cassini surveyed a control point network using a technique called triangulation. That type of network, also known as geodetic control network, became a standard feature in large-scale mapping projects. We can see the network on the right. This geodetic control network in a way anchored Cassini's survey of all of France and led to the celebrated Cassini maps. Next slide, please. The Napoleonic Wars accelerated this process throughout the Western world. Mapping agencies emerged as large science organizations. Fast forward to 20th century Germany. Compared to France, Germany seems to be a rather complicated place with a history that is fragmentary. A nation state only emerged in the early 1870s. Even then, a federal system ensured that a multitude of mapping agencies existed in various German states. German cartographic products reflect that diversity. Individual German states made heavy investments in their geodetic control networks that predate German unification. For political reasons and also because of the costs associated with conversion, the geodetic control networks were never fully linked until the Nazis arrived on the scene in the 1930s and flattened all political opposition. The Nazi dictatorship forced through the integration of these mapping platforms. The largest and most important set in the German Captures Maps collection is the topographic map series Germany 1 to 25,000. It's also the most complicated one. Berkeley owns over 4,000 sheets dating from the 1870s to 1945. Almost all of these sheets came from the Captured Maps Depository program. Some have ownership stamps that are quite interesting. On this map, we can see an ownership stamp that's from the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, that's the Land Survey Office. The National Civilian Mapping Agency is, it started as a regional agency, but the Nazis, kind of established it as National Mapping Agency. We can also see that there's, a lot of geodetic data in the margins of the map. It was surveyed in 1940, and that resurvey was part of an effort to link up that triangulation network, to integrate a large national network. Next slide, please. The person that was in charge of this national effort was a geodetic scientist, Erwin Gigas, that had been hired in 1928 to do research into geodetic networks. And the US Army intelligence team that arrived in Germany to collect all these maps in 1944, 1945, they realized that Gigas was a person of interest, that his work, which had consolidated not only the networks inside Germany and territories that were annexed to Germany, but also in other occupied areas, that this network and the data would be of extreme value to US military planners. And so in a way, we can think of this as a project that links World War II to the periods that came after it, kind of similar to the US Civil War and the Reconstruction period. The work that Gigas did and the way that the US Army Map Service operated links World War II with the reconstruction of Europe that came afterwards, and also the emergence of the United States as a global power and the Cold War. Next slide, please. So if we look at the German military mapping effort, there is one mapping agency that stands out in the collection. Most maps that Berkeley has come from a military mapping agency that was part of the Army General Staff. The Army General Staff is kind of like the planning organization of the military. We might think of it as a brain that runs planning. And so Germany did not have a mapping agency military mapping agency until 1936. And the Army General Staff found the perfect person to run it, a man named Gerlach Hemmerich. He had been a civilian planner and also a military geodetic scientist. That organization was rather small until World War II started. The wartime mobilization meant the organization would be scaled up. You know, lots of people were called up for service, cartographers. So the wartime mobilization increased the size of the organization to about 15,000 people. Next slide. So if we look at the mapping, we can see there are some differences to the US Army Map Service. The German military organization relied on resources outside Germany. So there was like a central mapping platform in Berlin called the Army Planning Chamber. But there are also these military units that operated in distant places throughout Europe. And one of them is this small detachment that operated in Norway. It was subordinated to the German Army of Norway, and it used aerial photography in an innovative way. You can see it on the left. We can also see that there are two military grids that are overprinted over this map. The German Army grid, basically geodetic data, and then a messaging grid that was used to convey information up the chain of command. Next slide, please. This is a slide that connects a place in France to the Bay Area. So if we think about World War II, you know, there was also an effort by German mappers to exploit occupied territories. So they created resource inventories. The group that did this was the section for military geography. And in this case, it worked for the German occupation government in France. What is shown here is an insert. It shows the Lorient Navy Arsenal in Western France. And this was the German headquarters for the Battle of the Atlantic, the submarine warfare. And of course, in the Bay Area, we have the Kaiser shipyards, the production battle, that was waged to win World War II. It was essential to roll out victory ships and liberty ships, and the Kaiser shipyards and other shipyards in the Bay Area mass-produced these ships. And so we can see that our history locally is linked to that in this collection. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm gonna take over now as the middle section as moderator of the some pre-planned panel discussion questions. And we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes on those. And then we're really excited to hear all of your questions as well. So you can pop those into chat, and Kristen and Benito will keep track of those. All right, so I learn something new every time I hear Julie and Heiko speak, and today was no exception. One of the questions that we thought about in kind of preparing for this session was and thinking, I guess, just back up just a minute to set the stage a little bit. One of our inspirations for putting together this panel was thinking about the similarities and differences between the Japanese and the German sets. And so that's part of our inspiration for this panel. And it's I'm hoping that we can kind of keep that in mind as we can move through the questions. because I think it's a really interesting comparative perspective. So our first question deals with these maps as hidden collections within our libraries. Why do you think these map collections remained so hidden for so long? And kind of a follow-up on that, what are some barriers that still exist around the processing of these collections?
Well, I can start us off with that, Susan. So I think especially for the German, but also for the Japanese collections, I think language barriers are very high on them. We found when we were processing the Japanese collection, we really needed somebody who was completely fluent in Japanese and English to be able to do the work on them, and also had an understanding of how to read maps and understand what the map information was. And that took some time to find a person who had all of those skill sets. It was interesting because as we started to process the collection, we noticed things like there were a number of maps in the Japanese sets that had they were set on a grid, but there was no latitude or longitude on them at all. And so it became very hard to even identify where the maps were located. We have a set of maps, about 60 maps of Shanghai, that don't have latitude and longitude noted on them at all. And we've tried to locate them by looking at the river network through there, but it's been changed so much in the intervening years that we can't connect it really solidly to the space on the Earth. So there are all sorts of little things that I think have made it harder and harder to process. We found at Stanford that the German collection came in to us fairly early, as I mentioned, right after we received it, and went into the central map collection, and then was cataloged using catalog cards, which is what they did back then, with a call number and that sort of thing. It wasn't until much later that those were transferred over to a digital library catalog. When we went to look at the Japanese collection in the East Asia Library, it was like walking back in time. It was if they had taken the maps out of the boxes and put them on a shelf, and they were pristine. It was as if they had been printed the day before, because in fact, they sort of had been, in that they'd been printed, sent through this whole processing loop, sent over to us and never touched again. And it wasn't until a graduate student came in and said, I heard you have these maps, I actually want to use them, that we even started to process them. And so I think given the lack of staffing, the language barriers, and the real difficulties in managing 11,000 sheets of collections or more, probably pushed it down on the list in terms of things that could get processed when easier things were on the top of the list. But I'm very happy to know that we're now starting to deal with these maps, which is making more interest and excitement in other libraries dealing with theirs as well.
I'd say we have to also consider the process of resource discovery. You know, if we look at this historically, we can see that these maps were not valued by American map librarians as much as Army Map Service or GSGS maps, you know, so there was no resource discovery, even though, you know, there's quite a bit of data on the maps, for example, about source map data. And even though the Army Map Service, for example, used a lot of this map data, you know, for example, we know from the work of Swiss cartographic historians that the Army Map Service map of Switzerland is derived from German map data. So, we can kind of also see that investment in resource discovery is essential, you know. So that investment was never there. So there was no, in a way, not sufficient respect for these collections. And I think some of that comes from language, you know, like difference. Of course, it takes some effort to do this. It takes skill to extract that information. So I think Julia is, of course, right. You know, that's, I think, the key.
One thing I do want to note is there were a few universities that really started to process their maps early on. One was Clark University. The other was actually Berkeley. And I'm delighted to see Phil Hain on the call. He did a lot of work on the Japanese maps and oversaw a project to do the processing of the Japanese maps. And when we started to do ours, we were able to go into the library catalogs and download those records and import them into our system and match things up. So I think there were really early efforts to what we would consider fairly early efforts to manage some of these collections that were harder to do. But by and large, the barriers, I think, were so high for most libraries that even today, there are a handful of us who have processed these, and the vast majority of the 35 libraries that got the maps have still not processed their collections, at least in a way that are easily findable in a library catalog.
Yeah, Phil Hain is a treasure. You know, I'm sitting on top of his work, and I greatly benefited from the work he did. You know, so he's, of course, yeah. I think the Berkeley records always were maybe a bit better than other records, and so Phil, you know, contributed to that, and so we can see a lot of people, a lot of other map catalogers linked to our records. As I update them, I can see that historically, you know. So what I would say is resource discovery and investment in resource discovery is important. You know, it really shapes how map data is found or isn't found.
Yeah, and I think that's a great transition to our next set of questions, which is really thinking about turning from these processing questions and discovery questions to the significance of the maps themselves as historical sources. So I think both of you have kind of illustrated examples in your presentations about what we can learn from looking at these maps. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what kinds of research you see being carried out with the information contained on the maps, and speak a little bit about how the maps allow us to view the past and the present in different ways.
Well, I think clearly the maps can be used to look at change over time. And that's what maps are often used for in terms of what's the difference, how has the landscape changed? How has the land use changed over time? Also, I think we see when the Japanese were doing the overlays on, say, the Russian maps, they really were looking, you can see how they were thinking of it very tactically in terms of what does a road network look like? Where are their food sources? Where is their fresh water? And these are the kinds of things that are notated on the maps. They were really used for a military, they were looking to use them for a military purpose. And it's obvious by the kinds of things that they pulled out and noticed on these, on the maps that were there. And so I do think that they were sending in cartographers in Japan, sometimes undercover, because people knew when you've got the cartographers walking in, they're either going to tax you or they're going to try to invade. So they were really careful, and there are notations of some of these Japanese cartographers being killed going out in the field to do their surveying work. So I think it was obvious in terms of how they were used for that kind of purpose. I think we don't have a good idea of how they're necessarily used now because we're just starting to make them available. We have had people in Japan go in and ask if they can take our 1 to 50,000 set of Japanese maps and be able to make overlays and process them in a way that is completely for a Japanese audience. And we've, of course, made that all of those scans available to them. So we're starting to see more pickup in Japan of the Japanese sets, which is one of the reasons why the usage of those maps from us are so high.
So most of the German maps are part of topographic map series. So what they do is they show, you know, Europe, a world that no longer exists in a way, in a lot of detail. You know, so if we think about the Holocaust, for example, there's the Städtelfinder, you know, and we can see all those places, you know, they're mapped in a detailed fashion on these sets. You know, there are some other sets like ethnographic maps, and we haven't digitized them yet. Those are interesting too. They show distributions of populations, and we kind of envision how the Nazis used those. You know, obviously they were interested in shifting boundaries, moving populations, and they also, of course, were used in carrying out the Holocaust. We can kind of envision that. So this is an important document for documenting Nazi crimes. Also, as I try to tell, you know, the stories that I told today, essentially was one that was rooted in the history of science and technology. So we can see how German cartographers were in some ways a bit ahead of the curve. Like they established this geodetic network that was quite unique. Prior to their efforts, there hadn't been integrated triangulation networks that covered more than 2 countries. And here they worked on a network that, spanned much of Europe. And so this is kind of something that can be seen on those maps too. And of course, there's also the UTM grid, that also came out of the work of German cartographers. So, this is kind of an interesting story. So in a way, there are many stories. We could look at the source data and see how the Nazi war machine sucked up all the source data in various places. Like if we look, for example, at Austria, Vienna, the vast resources of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and its mapping program, we can see all the source maps in the Nazi war effort. And of course, there's the other story here, and that is the Nazi mapping effort was quite large. There are other agencies involved, and we don't have those maps at Berkeley. Those maps would be at the Library of Congress. For example, maps that show geologic mapping, maps that were terrain maps. So those maps were produced by different mapping agencies. And we, as map librarians, we should watch for those maps because they're quite rare. There are nautical charts, aeronautical charts, and these maps I mentioned. And we should try to preserve them. We should make sure they don't get lost. Thank you.
Well, I think we've got a few other questions, but I want to make sure to leave time for the audience questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Benita and Kristen to manage the questions, and I'll jump back into my role as speaker.
Sure. The first question that came in was, are there German military maps of the Soviet Union? And if so, what were their sources?
Yeah, this is an important story. The person that ran the German military mapping effort, Gerlach Hemmerich, he was really interested in Soviet maps. Early on, he realized that they were quality maps, and of course, Soviet science education, as the Americans would find out during the Sputnik shock, was really very good, and so the Red Army maps reflected that. And so Hemmerich copied over the Soviet map data into the German system. And he, in fact, used features from that system. So the German military mapping effort became more systematic. Germans rolled out, a new format, the Deutsche Heereskarte format, and some ideas came from Soviet maps, because the Germans kind of improvised. Their military mapping agency was only established in 1936, but the Soviet mapping effort had already a deep history. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of good questions. The next one is, are there any issues about whether to repatriate the original materials?
I could speak to that just a little bit. I spent about a week in Japan, I guess a couple of years ago, speaking at the GIS conference and then going to a conference on digitization of Japanese maps and also looking at maps that had been sent overseas. And so we spent a whole day actually talking about repatriation of maps, or how maps were used and have been sent to other countries. And so it was quite an interesting discussion to hold, and also about what kind of maps should be digitized at what scale, because the American idea of things falling out of copyright and then being scanned and being made available to everyone is not something that's part of that culture over there in terms of the way they think about information and the types of information that are released. And so it was an interesting discussion to talk to them about it. The Japanese maps that we hold are held in Japan at about 4 or 5 different libraries, but they don't release them to the general public. They hold them quite tightly. They have not been scanned. In fact, when we were touring the collections one day at one of the universities, I asked if I could take a picture for myself of Japanese mapping of India, because I had heard that existed, but I had not actually seen it. And I was not allowed to do so. They said, no, we don't want you even to take a cell phone picture of these maps. So the maps, the Japanese scholars that I talked to during this conference were actually quite delighted that the maps were in the United States and that we were scanning them, because they had trouble. It was a lot of effort for them to get to see the physical maps that were in Japan. I think given the nature of these topographic maps and the fact that they are held in Japan, I didn't hear from them a lot of pressure to repatriate these sets of maps, although with the duplicate maps that we took in from the UTK, had the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency not wanted to take the duplicates, we would have tried to find a library in Japan that would want to take them back. So it would be our goal, if we ended up with extra collections and extra items, to see if we could repatriate them back to Japan. But there have been no requests for that. We also, no one has come to me to ask if we would return them. There had been concerns about us putting them up and whether or not it was okay to put up these maps, because this is a contentious time and there's been a lot of discussion over the last number of years about the Japanese and going into other countries and sort of the territoriality around this. But no one's come and asked us to take the maps down or the scans down. So we're quite sensitive to that, and want to be sensitive to the people who originally, where the maps were originally held, and what to do. But at this point, we've had no requests for that. I don't know if you've had any requests for that at Berkeley at all.
If we look at the history of the German maps, we can see that the Americans mapped up so much map data that German surveyors initially had trouble. They worked for microfilm provided by American military authorities. So there's definitely a shortage of original maps in Germany in the immediate after-war period. And then in the 1960s, there were negotiations. So it seems the US government was sensitive to these issues. And in 1961, Sakur, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Europe, the NATO institution, returned maps in possession of the US military to German sources. And in 1967, a large amount of map data and maps was returned to the National German Mapping Agency in Frankfurt. So there was an effort by US institutions to be sensitive. And in fact, I see Dirk Willig here on the call. Dirk wrote an article about the return of part of the Heringen collection. So part of it is still in the United States, but a part of it was also returned, geologic data that pertain to Germany itself. And so, this is an important topic. We have to be kind of aware of that. So the US intelligence operation that resulted in the collections that we have in hand was only one of many efforts to vacuum up map information. American troops and intelligence teams, so-called T forces, target forces, went into institutions like, for example, Justus Pertus, the world's largest map publisher located in Thuringia, and they took out tons of maps. So this is a rather interesting part of the story.
One of the things that worries me about today's mapping of the world is that it's often digitally done and new versions overlay older versions with the loss of data. How do librarians deal with this issue?
Susan, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find the question because I read better than I listen sometimes. Kristen, can you summarize that again, please?
I just pasted it back in if you'd
Okay,
like.
thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And with some map data that is controlled by military organizations, I think we have less control over how that is archived. And so that's really up more to we're relying more on the agencies themselves. But in terms of content that's produced in more publicly accessible ways, the libraries are starting to tackle this. So in California, we have a collaborative project between the UC campuses and Stanford to try and archive, for example, California local data. And that is something that we are pulling the underlying data that's made available and archiving that for future researchers so that you can track change over time. So we're having to learn new methods, I guess, and new workflows for that, and both in terms of collection, but also in terms of how we manage and store and preserve that data. Because Julie's example of the maps being on the shelf for 50 years and kind of being as intact as they were the day that they got printed or stored is definitely not the case with a lot of data. As all of us know, there's issues with data that don't translate well to 50 years of storage, at least not yet. So that's something we're actively dealing with.
And we have another question. This one is probably from a cataloger. They're mentioning how they've cataloged German maps and how confusing it is. And so the question is, for the 1936 to 46 era of German maps, is there a reference resource that gives all the names of the mapping agencies and their relationships to each other in time, space, and organization?
Yeah, I don't know that such a resource exists. It might be worthwhile to create it. So the problem, of course, is the complexity of the German mapping organization, which reflects the complexity of the Nazi regime. If we think about the Nazi regime structurally, then there are competing groups, for example, the SS, the German military, the Nazi party, and so we see that the mapping operation is complicated. There are also different general staffs: the general staff of the German armed forces, the general staff of the army, the general staff of the navy, the general staff of the air force. So each of those had mapping organizations. So people wrongly look at it and think, oh, this is the general staff. No, there's complexity. We see all kinds of bodies on those maps. And so we have to be very careful. It's not a uniform structure at all.
And I'll just jump in. It's not quite an answer to the question, but there's in the paper that Heiko and I published this week, we do include a timeline that is a very simplified view, but tries to outline the relationships as these organizations changed, at least at a high level. So it doesn't get into the details, but it was helpful for me, at least, to put together to try and make sense of these complex organizations.
So we're almost out of time, so maybe we'll just do this last question here. Given the alliance between Japan and Germany and their mutual antipathy of the Soviet Union, is there any evidence of exchange or working together on the mapping of this mutual enemy or any of their numerous adversaries? and I'll paste it into the chat again.
Wait, not that I know of. Heiko, do you know of any sort of collaboration that they did, or Susan?
No, I don't. I think that's extremely unlikely. You know, I also the distrust, you know, between the respective governments, you know, would have, I think, prevented that. You know, there was not a lot of cooperation. You know, the axis Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, you know, was more a propaganda, you know, tool. There was some coordination at the strategic level and some exchange of, you know, intelligence, but this was rather limited. You know, we know that.
Well, were there any other last comments before we close? Okay.
I think I did want to just mention that I think the issues that we need to wrestle with now are how we start to collaborate more clearly on the scanning efforts that have gone on, so that we're not doing a lot of duplicative work given the cost of these things versus cost of scanning, versus how we may have different editions or different information that are on maps over time. They're not always the same. So how do we balance that? And then I think the other thing that we need to think about is how we work in a more collaborative way to hopefully bring others into the fold. Like I said, we figured out that there was an 80% duplication rate between Tennessee's collection and ours, but it wasn't 100%. So it'll be very interesting when we can compare our holdings to Berkeley's, to the University of Washington, who's doing their Japanese maps now, and the other groups that hold them. Can we come up with a corpus of everything that was produced? That really the only way to do that is for all of us to process, but that's a lot of work and the overhead is very high. But hopefully some of us can do this and we can start to see where the corpus goes as a whole as we start to work through these issues. So I'm so excited with the work that Susan and Heiko are doing on their maps, what we're doing on ours, what University of Washington is doing, because we're really getting some momentum around understanding these collections in a more complete way.
Yeah, I think this is a shared enterprise, you know, and it's important to continue the work. This is just a snapshot. We're just not done yet, you know, and it will take a long time. And it's important to think about the role of the United States. You know, historically, World War II is a watershed. The United States didn't retreat into a shell. And the US Army Map Service was this big machine. It cranked out data sets. And it kind of is, you know, this tool that, you know, created all that data that we have in our collections. And we need to look at these connections between World War II and what came afterwards, you know, when the US emerged as a global power. And we also, you know, can see how there is a lot of continuity.
And Susan, did you have any comments or?
No, sorry, I muted myself because there's a truck going by. But yeah, no, I would definitely echo what Julie and Heiko said. And within our organizations, it's a huge collaborative effort and a lot of work to make these collections more accessible, but is definitely worth it. And figuring out where to put those priorities, I think, will be our strategy going forward. Yeah, and thank you to both Julie, Heiko, Benita, and Kristen, everyone for putting this panel on today.
Yeah, thank you. And Julie, do you want to put your contact information into the chat just so people can contact you? And I know that we have a few hands that are raised, but unfortunately we're not taking questions. Please email us at the ERT email and also at Julie's email that was just added into the chat. And thank you again to everyone who attended today and spending this time with us. So enjoy your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.